Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
In collaboration with Boise State Public Radio, the Community Library presents a new podcast, Sheep Stories. I'm host Vance Cunningham. Join me as we listen through the archives of the Trailing of the Sheep Festival to learn about the Scottish, Basque, and Peruvian immigrants foundational to the sheep herding industry over the past century. Hear their stories of traveling to Idaho and learning the language of the sheep. Find Sheep Stories wherever you get your podcasts and at boisestatepublicradio.org.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. Anyone who works in schools knows the importance of properly fed kids. In fact, data shows that food insecurity correlates with lower test scores, increased absences, even lower high school graduation rates. EducationData.org reports more than 75,000 children are food insecure right here in Idaho. And as our Troy Oppie reports, many school districts are dealing with increasing meal debt.
When families don't pay for school meals, the cost falls back to district coffers.
I think you're going to see a lot more school districts that are having to rely on general fund for their child nutrition.
That's Heather Plain, Nutrition Director for East Idaho's Bonneville School District and Public Policy Co-Chair of the Idaho School Nutrition Association. Child nutrition is a federal program. Districts get 28 cents per tray served and make up the difference at the cash register or from federal reimbursements for low-income students. Per meal costs are as low as possible. Most districts aim to break even on food service.
Food costs are super high. Parents don't want to pay $3.85 for a lunch for their high school student, but you can't go anywhere in town and get a meal for $3.85.
Certainly not one that meets all the nutritional requirements of the U.S. Department of Agriculture school nutrition program, she says. In Idaho, each school district manages its own meal debt. There's no statewide accounting of how much debt exists. Some districts meet federal low-income thresholds and get all meals for all students paid for. Individual schools may also qualify for universal free meals. 13 of 16 schools in the Twin Falls School District, for example, qualified this year for subsidized meals. District spokesperson Eva Craner told me by email, even with only 3 schools running cash registers, meal debt this year is already approaching $5,000. The district ended last year with nearly $67,000 in unpaid meal debt. In the state's 2 largest districts, West Ada had $178,000 in meal debt last June. A grant from nonprofit Hoops for Hunger covered about 30% of that debt, and more dollars were recovered from families through the summer. Boise schools last year had nearly $100,000 in meal debt, but that deficit was paid by the Boise Schools Foundation and other donors. Smaller districts, like McCall-Donnelly, don't have fundraising foundations.
Our meal balance debt is close to 30-some thousand.
That's McCall-Donnelly Superintendent Tim Thomas. That total isn't just from last year. McCall-Donnelly, like most districts, absorbs the debt in its general fund, but still tries to collect what's due.
We're working with families to figure out payment plans, and we understand that there's a high probability that we're probably not going to collect all of that debt.
Any amount they can get back is less pressure on an already strained budget.
We've reduced our staffing levels here. We've reduced teaching positions and some classified aid positions last school year.
To try and prevent the debt spiral, McCall-Donnelly trustees last month approved a new policy. They capped meal debt at $20 per student. Other districts cap debt too, though typically between $40 and $50 before any action is taken. In most districts, action is a call home and no change in the lunch line. McCall-Donnelly went further.
We wanted to make sure that there was some option for those kids, but not the full meal charge option.
A less-cost alternative meal. That practice is not new, but it's fallen out of favor in many places because of the shame associated with getting something different because you can't pay. Bonneville School District's Heather Plain says it used the practice until about 8 years ago.
At that time, we would have kids come through. They knew they owed money, and they would just about get to the cashier, and then they would run. They'd take their food and run. And I said, that's not what we're trying to create here. It should not fall on the kids.
The policy was also a huge stressor on cafeteria staff, she says, and worth ending. But meal debt quickly doubled after they stopped the policy. Thomas says the McCall-Donnelly board struggled with the decision to implement alternative meals. That board meeting and vote was not streamed or recorded, according to the district.
We've always supplemented our federal food service fund with what we use it as salad bars and healthy fresh fruit options, which are above and beyond what the typical lunch is. And so we're still going to provide them options, but not necessarily options to our above and beyond food choices.
So what can be done? Districts are trying to reach parents as soon as meal account balances go negative. Many districts can send families with large balances to collections, but that's rarely used. More communication is also important. Some families got used to free meals at school during the COVID-19 pandemic and still have to be reminded that program ended 3 years ago. Families are also encouraged to fill out applications for free or reduced lunch benefits. This year, that threshold for a family of 4 starts at nearly $60,000 of income. But simply filling out the form is a stigma for some, Plain says, and putting more responsibilities on families is not always a solution.
The biggest thing we're advocating for our children is universal meals for all. We saw incredible success when we came back to school from COVID. It absolutely took down all the walls of the haves and have-nots and the stigma, and all kids could just come and eat.
That's what the Boise School District has done, funding breakfasts last year for every student in every school. Spokesperson Dan Holler wrote by email that universal breakfasts are a way to ensure every student can start the day ready to learn. It cost Boise schools about $2.2 million to do that, but universal feeding for many districts is simply out of reach without additional state or federal help.
A lot of times we talk to our local representatives and they're not super concerned because it's a federal program. So we go to the federal level and it just depends on which administration is in, the interest that they take in it.
Districts will continue to work to educate families about what options are available. Boise schools still had that $100,000 in meal debt last year, even with universal breakfasts, but that total was down 62% from the year before. The district says, thanks in large part to getting more students and more school sites qualified for the available federal subsidies. Troy Oppie, Boise State Public Radio News.
And Troy is joining us now to talk more about this. Welcome back, Troy.
Hi, Gemma.
Okay, so let me understand this. Some school districts here in Idaho have really big amounts of debt. You mentioned 67,000 in Twin Falls, close to 100,000 in Boise, but then that really big number, 178,000 in Meridian. So some places have actually had to cut staff to make up this budget deficit?
Well, and it's part of overall budget stress, right? If the debt is not paid, school districts can't carry debt year to year. It has to be absorbed into the general fund, and that means that school districts that have to take that action just, they can't do as much with the general fund as they otherwise would have. And so it contributes in a lot of ways to this general stress on school district budgets. In McCall specifically, we were talking about in that story, it wasn't a direct link, a one-to-one link between school debt and not being able to fill certain positions. It's more of a cumulative effect on district budgets.
So you talked, as you said, about the McCall School District, and what they've done is decide to serve what they're calling this alternative meal to kids when their debts get too high. So talk to us about what they mean by that alternative meal.
Well, McCall-Donnelly uses some of its funding to supplement its school nutrition program. You heard in that piece, they try to go above and beyond what the base meal is for their students using that local funding. So the alternative meal, the way it was described to me by Superintendent Thomas, would really just be the basics, which is ultimately a lesser cost to the district to provide. Superintendent Thomas wasn't specific when we spoke just before their school year started because he said school food directors were still working out what that was going to look like. Before we published this story, I did reach back out to him to see exactly how it was playing out in schools, but he didn't respond to that specific question. He only confirmed that the alternative meal policy was in use. And I should say again here, too, that only kicks in when a student hits that $20 debt cap. That can happen as quickly as a week to 6 days of school, or 2 weeks, depending on how many meals a kid might get at a school.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Troy, what about this idea that other kids are going to know if another student has debt? I mean, first off, is that really what would happen? Because as one of the interviewees said in the story that you did, I mean, this is where we get kind of that shame and embarrassment happening for some students.
Yeah, and it's played out that way in other places where this or other policies that end up with kids getting something noticeably different for lunch. If it's a sack lunch as opposed to a hot lunch, whatever that policy is, if it's different, kids notice stuff, right? You've got kids, I've got kids.
Oh, yeah.
They are very aware of what's going on. And, as it played out in the Bonneville School District, you heard Heather Plain, who's that district's nutrition director and works for the State School Nutrition Association. You heard her say exactly what happened. Kids would have their tray, they'd get close to the cashier, and they would run. And that is not something that I had even considered, to be perfectly honest. And you couldn't hear it in the story because I record my voice on a separate track when I'm doing those interviews. I gasped when she said that. That was a very big gut punch to me when I was reporting that story. And it looks different in different places. It might be a different colored tray. It might be as simple as something that's not on the tray that otherwise would be. But kids notice.
Yeah. So, Troy, is there any way to know if this meal debt is happening because a family cannot pay versus a family will not pay? Because that is a distinct difference.
It is, and districts are getting better. Folks I talked with say, we've really put our pedal down, or put our foot on the gas pedal in terms of trying to reach out directly and work with families that might qualify for some subsidies that just haven't filled out the paperwork or didn't know it was available, to take these steps. The Boise School District credited some of its reduced student lunch debt volume last year to the simple fact that, they were able to automatically connect some of these kids' accounts with the fact that, they're already outside enrolled in Medicare. So that connection to a meal subsidy was automatic. They didn't have to go through that step. And so, districts are getting better at this. Folks I talked to in McCall have said, some of the frustration is some of the debt is coming from families that can pay, and they just don't, and it might slip their mind, but they send letters, they make calls home, they try to reach out and get this taken care of, and sometimes it just takes months. Many districts say, that amount that we ended the school year with, we were able to recover some of that $10,000, $20,000 even with some of these bigger numbers through the summer, as staff have time to be able to do some of that work and connect with families and get that debt paid off. So there is definitely a percentage that varies from district to district, obviously, but that's going to be families that have the means, but either haven't done it or aren't willing to do it for whatever reason.
So, Troy, West Ada, as you reported and as I mentioned, had quite a debt, $178,000 in debt. But they got a grant to help cover that cost. So are there other options for school districts that maybe they haven't even been aware of, like a grant like this?
Yeah, I think there are in some cases. I didn't delve into that too terribly much because it is kind of unique to whatever district you're in and whatever population area you're in as far as what might be available. That grant, I gave it as a percentage in the story, but it was a $55,000 fundraiser that was done for West Ada. The district communications officer told me that kind of ate into that balance, and then they were able to use continued push to collect some of that debt through the summer to take that number out. But it was still a six-figure number that had to be absorbed into that general fund. And I got the sense that district officials kind of know this is coming, and you can prepare for it to a certain extent. So it's not such a shock, but it is still, at the end of the day, being absorbed into the general fund, which is, I think, safe to say, harmful for school district budgets.
Well, and then Troy, you mentioned that the Boise School District was able to make up its debt with help from donors.
Mm-hmm.
But again, that's pretty unique. We're talking about the largest city in Idaho. There are people who send their kids to school at the Boise School District that have the ability to be donors. That is not the case in numerous other districts in the state.
They are one of one as far as the districts that I talk to. Some districts, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, don't have meal debt because I think I mentioned a few minutes ago, they don't have meal debt because the district wide qualifies for these federal subsidies, or many schools out of an individual district, as I mentioned in the story, qualify. So they're doing that. But as far as districts getting charitable donations to pay it off entirely, Boise was the only one I found. I think it should be noted too, this is going back pre-pandemic, but the Chobani notably paid off the meal debt in the Twin Falls School District, I think 2018, maybe 2019, and that, if I'm just remembering this now, that I think was around $50,000 to $60,000 of a donation. So it's happened before, but it is not in any way typical or to be expected.
So Troy, the districts that you talked with, did they feel frustrated by all of this? I mean, we know kids who are hungry. We know that they don't learn as well, but at the same time, these school budgets are working with a finite budget. I mean, I can't imagine that any school district official, any teacher, is okay with seeing a child be hungry.
No, they're not. And they do, they work incredibly hard, I think, at the staff level specifically, to make sure that kids who are hungry can eat. And it might not look like, the meal that goes out of the food line for a full pay student necessarily, but they are doing everything that they can do to make sure kids can eat. And I got the sense from talking to Superintendent Thomas that, McCall specifically, they really felt boxed into a corner. They didn't know what else they could do. And smaller districts certainly are going to feel the impact. There's just less availability to absorb, that level of debt into your general fund without it really becoming noticeable in some ways. And so, districts, they don't like having to do this, obviously, and you can argue that there are better alternatives, or there are alternatives, better or not, in dealing with it, but they have to take action in some way because there's nowhere else to go.
Yeah. Well, Troy, really appreciate this report and you bringing it to our attention. We've been speaking with our reporter and All Things Considered host Troy Oppie about his investigation into meal debt in Idaho school districts. We will, of course, put a link to Troy's story on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. And that'll do it for this episode of Idaho Matters. Thanks so much for listening. And just a reminder, you can find all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts.